The sub-vault corridors smelled of stone that had never seen sun and something older than that, a mineral patience, the particular cold of rock that has been underground since before anyone thought to use it for anything, and has long since stopped either objecting to the dark or welcoming it. Bill Weasley had been working in these passages for 5 months, and still could not decide whether the smell was comforting or ominous. Both, he had concluded, in the way that most things were both since May. The work was this. In March, the heist had done what heists do, damage at a scale that ministry announcements smoothed over, and that the actual repair work revealed in its real, inconvenient particularity. The Ukrainian iron belly had taken out a section of the upper vaulting when it tore through, half-blind and terrified, trailing 3 wizards and several dozen ruined detection chains. Sub-corridors 4 through 6 had needed resealing. Deeper down in the restricted deposit passages, the resonance from triggered alarms had disturbed vault wards the goblins had maintained for generations without disruption. So Gringotts had, very quietly, reached out. Trusted curse breakers, preferably not war heroes with complicated histories involving the facility. Preferably someone who understood that a goblin's definition of ownership and a wizard's were not the same definition, and who had the professional self-possession not to say so aloud in a room full of goblins. Bill had been available. He was grateful for it, if he was honest with himself, which he tried to be. It was easier here, in the stone cold and the measured quiet, than at Shell Cottage where Fleur handed him cups of tea with that particular expression, love and grief and helplessness arranged on her face with the care of someone who had practiced holding them still, and where Fred's name lived in every silence, because every silence was shaped exactly like him now, and had been since May, and Bill was not yet convinced that would change soon. The goblins treated him with the professional courtesy of people who had decided to tolerate his presence. Nothing more than that. Nothing less. He hadn't expected more. The heist was not his doing, but he was a Weasley, and Harry Potter had been staying in his house the week before, and goblins kept precise accounts of such things. He nodded to Grimlin the archivist each morning. Grimlin nodded back. In 5 months, this had not changed. The scars on Bill's face from Greyback's claws, set and pink now, visible in the vault lantern light whenever he leaned close to examine a seal, had never drawn comment from any of them. That was, in its way, a sustainable arrangement. Weasley. He turned. Grimlin was standing at the junction of Sub-Corridor 7 and the restricted deposit passage, holding something small at arm's length, with the neutral precision of someone delivering a thing that had been waiting a very long time. The scroll case was about the length of Bill's forearm, copper-cased, sealed with wax so old the color had gone from red to the dark brown of old blood. He could read, even from 3 feet away, the name pressed into the seal. Lily Potter. Below the name, a date. September 1981. He did not take it immediately. Grimlin held it out without urgency, without apology, with the composed neutrality that communicated everything about what had and had not occurred here. The goblins had held this correctly. They had done nothing wrong whatsoever. Whoever should have come to claim it had not come, and so they had continued to hold it, because that is what you do with things you have been entrusted to keep. They were not a library with an overdue notice. They were Gringotts, and Gringotts held. "How long has this been in the deposit passage?" Bill asked. "Since September 1981, Grimlin said. 17 years. The number took up a great deal of space in the corridor for something made only of words. Bill was 28 years old. In September 1981, he had been 11, at Hogwarts, writing home to ask his mum for the dragon book he'd left on the kitchen table, and possibly biscuits if she wasn't too busy. Lily Potter had been 21 years old. She had walked into this building and handed this case to a goblin archivist, and, presumably, believed that someone would come for it within a reasonable amount of time. No one had come for it. 17 years was a very long time for something to sit in the dark, waiting for a person who was never going to come. He took the case with both hands, the way he took things in vaults when he did not yet know what they were capable of. The copper was cold through his work gloves. The preservation seal had not cracked. The wax had held through 17 years with the same stolid, untroubled competence as everything else in this building. He was a curse breaker. He had spent years learning to read what objects held, not the spell work, which was a matter of training and technique, but the residue beneath that, the weight of things that had been waiting. This was not a hostile object. This was a document. Someone had sat down and written something they needed their son to have if they were not there to give it, had sealed it in copper and wax, and brought it here. It had been waiting since then. September 1981 to October 1998. 17 years and 2 months. He thought about the hole behind Shell Cottage, the one Harry had dug himself the morning after they escaped. No magic, just the small garden spade and the early grey light and the particular set of Harry's shoulders as he worked, until it was deep enough. They had buried Dobby there. Bill had stood back and let Harry lead it, because some things belong to the person doing them, and shouldn't have other people's hands in the process. Harry had straightened when it was finished, said 3 or 4 words in a voice too quiet to carry, and turned away with his eyes dry and that specific look he got, the one that wasn't composure exactly, but had learned composure's face over so many years of needing it. He thought about Fred. He thought about carrying Fred out of the great hall with his father at one end and himself at the other. The terrible lightness of it. The way grief has a physical property when it arrives all at once that nothing in your prior life prepares you for. He looked at the copper case in his hands. September 1981. She had been 21 years old. She had sat down and written something for her son, sealed it, and brought it to the one institution she trusted to keep it. Then she had gone home, and 6 weeks later, she had stood in front of a door and refused to move aside, and someone had killed her, and her son had ended up in a cupboard under a staircase, and no one had come here. "I'll need a retrieval log," he said, "and a receipt." Grimlin already had the ledger open. An hour later, Bill stood at the Diagon Alley Owl post, the street showing its damage in the way post-war rebuilding showed damage. You could see where it had been hurt if you knew what to look for. He borrowed a tawny owl from the postal stand and wrote Harry's name on a short note. "Just, there is something at Gringotts that belongs to your family. Can you come?" "Bill." He watched the owl go up into the grey. Then he went back inside. The copper case sat on Grimlin's desk in the archive room, under a preservation charm, with the same quality of patient illegibility as everything else in this building. Outside, Diagon Alley was getting on with being Diagon Alley. Scaffolding, fresh mortar, people who had decided, for now, that forward was the only navigable direction. Above, the city moved, and the case sat on the desk and waited, as it had been waiting since September 1981, since a 21-year-old woman had walked out of Gringotts into an autumn afternoon and gone home to die. The document was not quite Muggle and not quite wizarding. It had the quality of something that had predated the International Statute of Secrecy and simply outlasted the separation by being more fundamental than either category. A record of intent, the kind of thing both worlds had always needed people to write. Lily Potter had obtained the correct form through the Order, which maintained a relationship with a wizarding solicitor who asked very few questions of people who needed wills at 21. She had thanked him carefully and with full attention, as she thanked all people she found it difficult to need. It was late. The kitchen table at Godric's Hollow was solid oak, the kind that came with a house and stayed, the kind that did not apologize for outlasting its owners. She sat in her usual chair, the one with the slightly uneven leg that required a square of folded parchment under the back right corner to sit straight, and she spread the document across the surface and looked at it for a long moment before she picked up the quill, the lamp on the windowsill, the curtains she'd put up herself in April. Before any of this. Outside, September had gone properly dark. Harry was asleep upstairs. He had gone down without much protest tonight, which was rare for a boy of approximately 13 months who had developed strong opinions about when other people considered it reasonable for him to sleep. She had listened to him settle, the specific subsidence of a small person giving in to unconsciousness. And then she had sat here. The house was quiet in the way houses went quiet under the Fidelius charm, which was not the quiet of emptiness, but of something held deliberately close, like being cupped in a careful hand. She dipped the quill and began. She was methodical about it. This was not a document she expected to need. She expected, with the reasonable hope that functioning people extended toward their own futures, that she and James would both come through whatever Voldemort intended, and that this would sit in a solicitor's records for decades and be destroyed unread when she was 80. She was writing it because she wrote things that needed to be written, in the same way she brewed things that needed to be brewed. You did not skip the preparation because you expected not to need it. You documented, and then you hoped. The first name was Sirius Black. She wrote it without hesitation. Harry's godfather since Harry was 3 weeks old. James had named him that in a small, quiet ceremony, and Sirius had cried, which James had marked as an occasion to be commemorated indefinitely. Sirius was reckless in the way that people were reckless when they loved without reservation and considered consequences second. He would make impossible decisions on Harry's behalf, and the decisions would come from a surplus of love rather than any failure of judgment, and Harry would grow up understanding. In the wordless way, children understood things they had always been shown, that he was absolutely wanted. She trusted that. She trusted him with her life. She trusted him with her sons. She also trusted, if she was being honest with herself about the whole of it, that the responsibility would change him, that being the person Harry needed would make Sirius more careful in the particular way that only something worth protecting could. She wrote the secondary names more slowly, not from uncertainty, but from the gravity of the act itself. Frank Longbottom, Alice Longbottom. She had watched them with Neville, their son, 14 months old now, born one day before Harry, who had Alice's steady gaze, and already had Frank's way of laughing at things that surprised him rather than startling. She had watched the particular quality of attention they brought to parenthood, neither anxious nor inattentive, but present in the way that people were present when they understood exactly what the world was capable of, and had decided their child was worth the cost of staying in it. They were Aura's, Order members. If Sirius was unavailable for any reason, she wrote it as a practical contingency, nothing more. Then Harry would go to people who had already proven they would not flinch. She sealed the section. She moved on. She was nearly finished when James appeared in the doorway. He had a quietness about him when he read, the same quality he'd had at 17 in the library, which she had noticed before she'd admitted she was noticing. And he read over her shoulder now without speaking until he had reached the end. "You haven't named Petunia," he said. "No." He pulled the opposite chair out and sat. He was quiet for a moment, which meant he was thinking about it properly, which meant he understood the problem and was trying to find the angle of it. "The blood protection," he said. "I know." She set down the quill. "I've been thinking about it." She had been thinking about it for months. Sacrificial magic, love freely given, a choice made and not unmade, a person standing between a child and a curse and refusing to step aside, was old. Older than most of what passed for established theory. She had read everything the Order's library had on it, some things it didn't officially hold, and what she had come to understand was this. If she died for Harry deliberately and of her own will, there was a form of protection that might attach to him. Ancient and unpredictable but real. It required anchoring. It needed a blood relative of hers, someone who shared her blood, who could carry the intention into their home and hold it there by virtue of simply being who they were. The only person alive who shared her blood was Petunia, who had not sought out Lily's company willingly since the summer Lily had turned 17, and Petunia had decided what she thought of that. "If the blood magic works, Dumbledore will decide what to do with it," Lily said. "He'll know what it requires. He'll go to Petunia." James was looking at her steadily. "And if what it requires means he puts Harry with the Dursleys instead of... then that is his decision to make, and I trust him to make it." She picked the quill up again. "He'll weigh the blood magic against everything else, including what I've written here. That's a decision for someone who has information I don't have and authority I don't have. The will is mine. It says who I trust with Harry, who I know would love him. That's what I can document." She looked at the page rather than at him. "I'm not going to name Petunia in a will and have Harry think I chose that. I'm going to name the people who would choose him." James was quiet for a while. Outside, something moved in the garden, a hedgehog, probably. They had one that came through periodically with a sense of territorial authority, entirely out of proportion to its size. The lamp on the windowsill threw its small, warm circle across the table. "All right," James said. He said it to the document more than to her, which meant he was not entirely all right with it, but had decided that her reasoning was sound enough to defer to. That was what their disagreements usually resolved to, a point where one of them said, "All right," and meant, "I trust you more than I doubt this." "I'm not finished." "I know. I'll make tea." She finished the document. She sealed it with the preservation charm the solicitor had shown her, a firm thing, tamper-evident, designed specifically to wait. She put her name on the outside, and below it, the date. September 1981. She was at Gringotts the next morning. Harry left with James, the sealed case under her arm. The bank received her with its particular brand of professional indifference. She was shown to an archivist's window. She provided her name, and the subject's name, and the conditions for the document's release, and the goblin across the counter logged all of this in a ledger with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it several thousand times and found no occasion in any of those times to volunteer an opinion on the matter. The scroll case was sealed into the deposit archive. The ledger was closed. "This will be held until claimed," the archivist said. "Thank you," Lily said. She walked out of Gringotts into the September afternoon. The street was busy, shopping, someone's child crying with the particular outrage of a child who has been told no, two witches haggling outside the apothecary with the comfortable energy of people who do this every week. The sky was that specific English autumn pale blue that offered a reasonable case for optimism if you were inclined to take it. She stood on the steps for a moment and let herself take it. Harry was at home with James. She had done what she could. She was 21 years old. She had 6 weeks left. The motorbike had been Sirius's, borrowed for the night because Hagrid needed to cross a considerable distance quickly with a 15-month-old baby bundled to his chest. And when you were 11.5 feet tall and had been crying since Godric's Hollow and were not going to stop for some time yet, the motorbike was the practical choice. He flew with the particular care of someone very large in charge of something very small, steering with one arm while the other was wrapped around Harry, and the November air hit him at something between sensation and punishment, and Harry slept through all of it. Harry had green eyes. Hagrid had not been able to see them in the dark, but he'd seen them earlier, when he'd come through what was left of the front door on Dumbledore's orders and found the baby in the debris and picked him up and looked at him. This 15-month-old boy who was alive when everything around him was not, who would wake up tomorrow and need breakfast and have no idea at all. He had his mum's eyes and his dad's black hair and a confusion of plaster dust on his face and a cut on his forehead that would probably scar. Hagrid had wept then with the particular completeness that people wept when they had a great deal of feeling and no mechanism for containing it. He had been weeping, with some continuity, ever since. The tears went cold in the night wind, and he wiped them on his sleeve when they obscured his vision and kept going. He sat down on Privet Drive in the small hours, engine coughing to quiet. The street was everything it was, neat, dark, wholly respectable in the suburban way that communicated a firm preference for everyone minding their own business. Number 4 had a tidy garden path and a front door painted black and a letterbox that suggested regular polishing. It was the kind of house that looked precisely like what it was, which was precisely the problem. Dumbledore was waiting at the end of the garden path, with the street lamps extinguished and his hands folded. He had the expression of a man who had made a decision and had already moved inside it and set up residence. McGonagall stood a little apart. She had been a cat all day, 11 hours on a brick wall across from the house, watching the family go about its ordinary business with all of a tabby cat's patience and considerably more of a woman's dread. She had her conclusions. The man was large and pink and dealt in drills, and had the air of someone who believed that anything he didn't understand was probably dangerous, and probably someone else's fault. The woman was thin, and watched her own front garden, the way some people watched rivals. There was a child, large and fair, who was going to be thoroughly unpleasant. She had sent all of this to Dumbledore in a report, and Dumbledore had thanked her, and not been surprised by any of it. She was, standing there now, still not comfortable. Hagrid transferred Harry to Dumbledore's arms, with the careful gravity of someone returning something irreplaceable to someone who would, he told himself this, know what to do with it. The baby was asleep, one small fist against his chin, black hair disarranged. Dumbledore stood with him for a moment and looked down at the sleeping face with the expression of a man doing arithmetic on things that had no comfortable sum. "Albus," McGonagall said, "I cannot believe we're leaving him here, with these people." "The blood," Dumbledore said. He had said it to her before. He said it again. Lily's sister is the only living blood relative. The protection that Lily created, the ancient love magic, the binding she worked. It requires a blood anchor. Someone who shares Lily's blood, who can carry the intention into their home and hold it there simply by being who they are. Petunia is the only person alive who provides that. But there must be someone. There is no one else who can do this particular thing. He said it gently. He said almost everything gently, which was not the same as saying it with less certainty. She knew the mechanism well enough not to dispute it. Sacrificial love invoked deliberately, the mother standing between the child and the curse, choosing and not unchoosing, created a protection that required blood to hold it, a blood relative's home to anchor it. This was established magic, not theory. And standing on that pavement, in the cold, she thought, but is there something else? Is there a will somewhere? Some document that Lily or James left? Because they were intelligent people who knew they were hunted, and Lily in particular had never left anything that needed doing undone. Some legal record that should be consulted before you set a child on a doorstep at midnight? She did not ask it. She had trusted Dumbledore for 30 years. She trusted the precision in his voice when he said there was no one else. She trusted that he had already considered every question she might raise and had found them outweighed. She trusted the system. She would carry that unasked question for 17 years. Dumbledore bent and laid Harry on the step. A letter followed, tucked at the child's side, addressed in Dumbledore's hand to Petunia Dursley. He straightened and looked at the door. Black paint, polished brass, the ordinary face of the house that would shape the next decade and a half of a boy's life. And then he turned, and the three of them left Privet Drive to the dark. In a restricted deposit corridor beneath Diagon Alley, a copper scroll case bearing the name Lily Potter in wax sat in the Gringotts archive and held exactly what she had written and waited, quietly, to be claimed. No one came. The night passed. The morning came to Privet Drive, and Petunia Dursley opened her front door, and the thing on her step was not something she had been expecting. The burrow in late October 1998 smelled of old stone and the low warmth of something left in the oven. The garden had the particular autumnal look of a garden, tended lovingly, and then tended rather less lovingly, because everyone who usually tended it had other things weighing on them. Harry was on the lean-to roof, with a stack of replacement tiles and a bucket of fixative charm. Ron was below, passing tiles up and maintaining a running disagreement about which angle the ridge needed. Hermione was in the kitchen. She had been reorganizing the spice shelf twice already, since they'd come in September, which Harry understood to mean she was doing things in the order she could bear to do them, and had not yet reached the others. The owl arrived from the southeast, a Gringotts tawny. Harry had learned over the summer to recognize the bank's birds by their particular purposeful flight. It came directly to him, perched on the tiles beside the bucket, and thrust out a leg. Bill's handwriting. He unfolded the note on the roof, while Ron said something below about the angle of the eaves. There is something at Gringotts that belongs to your family. Can you come? Bill. He read it once. He read it again. The October light lay flat and pale across the garden, and in the kitchen a jar clicked against a shelf, and Ron passed another tile up without commentary, and Harry sat on the lean-to roof with the note in his hand and felt something that was not quite dread and not quite hope settle into the space behind his sternum, quiet and certain as a dropped stone going down. The wing that had taken the worst of the Iron Belly's escape was still under scaffolding, the upper colonnade roped off, a team of goblins working the repair at a pace that communicated something precise about the difference between correcting a problem and forgiving it. Harry noticed this as they came through the main doors, and then noticed the tellers noticing him, and he kept walking. He had been here twice since May, both times for account matters. Vault 687, which held what his parents had left him. On both visits, he had nodded to the tellers and received nods in return, and no one had mentioned the dragon or the Lestrange vault or the damage. Harry had not apologized again after the first time. The first apology had been received in silence, so calibrated that he understood apologizing was not the point. Bill walked beside him with the ease of someone who had long since accepted that no one owned Gringotts, and found this professionally interesting. Ron was behind them, Hermione's hands were folded in front of her in the particular way that meant she was stopping herself from producing a list. A junior archivist led them through corridors Harry hadn't been through before, not toward the vaults, but toward an older part of the bank where the stone held a different quality of cold. The reading chamber was small. A table, chairs, one goblin seated at the far end with the copper scroll case in front of him, and the composure of someone who had done this many times and found it unremarkable. McGonagall was already there. She had not come with them. She had arrived separately, which required no explanation. She was headmistress of Hogwarts, and she had been present at 4 Privet Drive on the night of 1st November 1981, and she sat at the table with the look of a woman who had decided to be in this room and was going to remain in it, regardless of what the next hour asked of her. She nodded once at Harry. He nodded back. Everyone sat. "Lily Evans Potter," the goblin said, without preliminary. "Will and Testament, dated the 22nd of September, 1981. Submitted to the Gringotts Deposit Archive the 23rd of September, 1981. Held unclaimed." He broke the seal on the scroll case with a small instrument and unrolled the document inside. "I will read this in full." Harry had seen his mother's handwriting once, a torn letter she'd written to Sirius, found at Grimmauld Place during the war. Neat and quick, the handwriting of someone who wrote often and wrote fast. He recognized something of it now across the table as the goblin held up the document and set it flat. The goblin read, "I, Lily Evans Potter, being of sound mind and aware of the particular circumstances in which my family finds itself, do set out herein my wishes regarding the care and guardianship of my son, Harry James Potter, in the event that I am not living to provide it myself. These wishes are not conditional. They reflect my considered judgment as his mother." The room held this. "Primary guardian, if I die before Harry reaches majority, Sirius Orion Black. By character, the person I trust most with my son's happiness. In the event that Sirius is—" McGonagall made a sound, not quite a word. Something shorter than a word, and lower, that she caught before it could become anything else. Her hands flattened on the table, and she did not look at Harry. Bill said it quietly. "Sirius Black was arrested on November 1st, 1981. The day after this was written. Convicted without trial," Hermione said, to the table. 12 years in Azkaban. He was killed in June 1996. Harry said it himself because he preferred to. Bellatrix Lestrange. He had known all of this since he was 13. None of it was new. It was the context that was new. His mother's handwriting. The word trust, the day after. The goblin continued without pause. "In the event that Sirius is unable to serve in this capacity, I name as secondary guardians Frank and Alice Longbottom, husband and wife, auras of the Ministry of Magic. I have watched them with their son. I know what it is to see people choose love as a deliberate act, and I trust them entirely with what Harry needs." Ron's face went still. He had grown up knowing the Longbottoms the way children who came from wizarding families knew things, not as historical abstraction, but as Neville's specific, ongoing grief. The ward at St. Mungo's, the Rappers. He had shared a dormitory with Neville Longbottom for 7 years, and he knew exactly what it looked like to carry something every day that you couldn't put down. Hermione's hand found Harry's arm. The goblin read on. Property clauses, financial provisions, the vault, the estate, conditions for Harry's education, other names, people Lily had trusted, most of them dead now, the orders accounting. He read it all in the same unbothered voice, and no one spoke, and the cold of the older stone held them in it. McGonagall rose from her chair. She did not leave the room. She rose and then she sat back down again, both movements too controlled to be anything but a person, managing something that wanted to be larger than the room permitted. She put her hands back on the table and looked straight ahead at nothing. Then the goblin reached the last section. To my son Harry, if you are reading this, I am sorry you needed to. I wrote this, hoping you would never need to, that you would grow up with me alive, and this document collecting dust for 60 years. I know what kind of hope this is, and I wrote it down anyway. The same flat voice. Riverstone. I named Sirius first, because he loves your father, and because he will love you the same way, without conditions. I named the Longbottoms because I have watched Alice hold her son when she thought no one was looking, and I trust her completely. These are not choices I made because they were convenient. They are choices I made because you deserve people who will choose you back. Harry had not moved. Whatever happened, whatever is true by the time you read this, I need you to know that I sat down and thought about you specifically. Not about what was safest or what was easiest. About you. About who should have you. I am your mother, and I am 21 years old, and I am going to go home now, and I am not going to think about this document again if I can help it. But I wrote it. You should know I wrote it. L. The goblin set the parchment down. He rolled it with care and replaced it in the scroll case, then produced a second sealed copy and placed it on the table in front of Harry. The estate remains in custodial status with Gringotts until claimed in full. This reading completes the formal record. He stood. Do you have questions? It was not quite a question. No one answered. After a moment, the goblin left. They sat in the reading chambers cold. Bill refilled the glasses from a water carafe that had materialized at some point without any of them noticing. Ron drank his. Hermione looked at the sealed copy in Harry's hands without quite looking at it. It was Hermione who said, eventually, Neville. Frank and Alice Longbottom, the Janus Thicky ward, alive but unable to recognize their son, and hadn't been able to since shortly after the night this document was written. He doesn't know, Harry said. No, Bill said. He's 18 years old. Harry set the sealed copy on the table and picked it up again. He'll want to know. No one disagreed. No one said what they were also thinking, that knowing would cost Neville something, and that Neville had already paid considerably, and that some knowledge was a debt of love you took on even when you hadn't chosen it. They all knew Neville. They knew what he would say if given the choice, which was that he wanted to know. He always wanted to know. He had been carrying this particular shape of loss since he was 15 months old, and he had never once tried to set it down. McGonagall had not spoken since the goblin left. She was looking at the wall in the way of someone who is not looking at the wall, but has temporarily run out of capacity for the room, and Harry did not press her. Some things were going to need longer than an afternoon. He put the sealed copy of the will in his coat pocket. She walked out of Gringotts, and the autumn hit her. October in Diagon Alley, scaffolding on the buildings to her left, a length of fresh cobblestone on the south side that didn't quite match the older stone around it. The reconstruction had been going since June. It was going to be going for some time yet, though people moved through the street with the determined ease of people who had decided the extraordinary would not be permitted to remain extraordinary. She walked among them with her hands at her sides, and her heels making their usual sound on the stone, and the sealed copy of Lily Potter's will sitting behind her eyes, like something that had always been there, and had only now been named. She had been headmistress for 5 months. She had been many things for much longer. She had been a transfiguration teacher for decades, a head of house, a deputy, a member of the order twice over. She had made difficult decisions and deferred to difficult men and watched the consequences of both. The leaky cauldron was at the end of the street. She walked toward it with the pace of someone who had a great deal to think about and had decided that thinking would be more useful than stopping. The morning of 1st November 1981 had been a long time ago. She had spent 24 years since then not thinking about it directly. Not the way you didn't think about things you had made peace with, but the way you didn't think about things that sat in a drawer you never opened because there was nothing in that drawer that was going to have changed. She had raised the question on the night itself. She had been overruled. That was the architecture of the memory, and she had left it at that. What she had not left at was this. The drawer had not been empty. She had arrived at Privet Drive by cat, which was how she had spent the entire previous day. 11 hours on a cold brick wall across from number 4, watching. She had watched Vernon Dursley leave the house at 8 in the morning in a large car and return in the same large car at 6 in the evening, with the specific quality of a man who believed the world held nothing that could not be managed by not asking about it. She had watched Petunia Dursley trim the front hedge and speak to her neighbour about something to do with a bin collection schedule, and look at her own roses the way certain people looked at things that belonged to them, primarily as evidence of their worthiness of having things. She had watched the boy, a large, fair child of roughly 18 months, which struck her at the time with a particular quality she hadn't put a name to, and put a name to now without trying. He was the same age as Harry. She had written all of this to Dumbledore in a report, and Dumbledore had thanked her and was unsurprised by any of it. And then Hagrid had come down from the sky with a sleeping infant against his chest and eyes, so red he looked as though he had been crying for hours, which he had. And Dumbledore had taken the child, and she had said, she remembered the exact words or close enough to them, "These people are the worst sort of muggles, unimaginative and mean. You cannot seriously mean to leave him here." And Dumbledore had said, "The blood." He had explained it the way he explained things he had already decided, completely, carefully, and in a way that left no apparent gap. Lily Potter's sacrifice, the ancient love magic, the blood anchor, the only person alive who shared Lily's blood and could carry the protection into a home and hold it simply by being who she was. He said there was no one else who could do this particular thing. He said it gently, which was how he said things he had already decided. She had said, "But is there nowhere else? Is there truly no one?" And Dumbledore had said, "No one who can do this." And she had stopped. She had trusted him for 30 years. She trusted the completeness of his explanations. She trusted that if there were an alternative he had not already weighed and found wanting, he would have said so. That a man who had spent decades making the wizarding world's hardest decisions would have the particular honesty to say, "I have not checked everything," when he had not checked everything. It had not occurred to her to ask. She had asked the wrong question. She had asked, "Is there nowhere else?" Which was the question of a person who had accepted that Dumbledore had already thought of everywhere else. She had not asked, "Have you checked Gringotts?" She had not asked, "Did Lily leave anything?" She had not asked, because she assumed, because she always assumed, that when Dumbledore said no one else, he meant no one else after looking. The leaky cauldron was warm and badly lit, and half full of people having an ordinary Tuesday, which was something she had been grateful for all year, and which she was now walking through without quite seeing. Tom behind the bar, a table of witches with shopping bags. The flue was at the back. She gave her destination and stepped through. Hogwarts arrived around her the way it always did, stone and torch smoke, and the particular cold that the castle maintained against all seasons. A cold that was not unpleasant, but was specific to this building, as though the stone itself had a temperature it preferred and declined to move from. The entrance hall was scaffolded on the eastern side still. The battle had brought down a section of the upper gallery, and the repair was careful and slow, because this was Hogwarts, and careful and slow was how you did it here, or you did it wrong. She walked through the entrance hall and up the main stairs and through corridors she had walked for decades. She knew every stone. She had walked this route as a student, as a young teacher, as a deputy who walked it on late nights when the castle was quiet and she was trying to solve something by moving through it. She had walked it the morning of the 2nd of May this year, when the battle was over and the dead were laid out in the great hall, and she had had to decide, in the space of a few hours, what it meant to be the person who held this building together, now that the person who had always held it together was dead. Dumbledore had been dead for over a year. She had had time, she had been telling herself she had had time, to process the shape of the absence. She had the office now. She had the passwords, the portraits, the responsibility. She had the particular grief of a person who had disagreed with someone for years and loved them anyway, and lost the chance to say either thing with any completeness. She had, she thought, been carrying a smaller grief underneath that one for 17 years, and she had not known what it was until this morning. It was the question she had not asked. Not because she was incurious, not because she was incapable of asking it. She had asked Dumbledore dozens of hard questions over the decades, had pushed back on his decisions when she disagreed, had protested the doorstep placement with everything she had that night, but because she had trusted that the architecture of his certainty was complete. She had trusted the system. She had not asked, "Have you looked?" because she had assumed looking was what he had done. She stopped outside the entrance to the headmaster's office and stood there for a moment. The gargoyle regarded her. She gave the password, and the stair revealed itself, and she went up. The office was hers now, or it was the office now, and she was the one in it. She had moved some things, left others. The pensive was still in its cabinet. The portraits of former headmasters lined the walls. Dippet, Fortescue, a long line of faces going back centuries, all of them painted into their particular poses of authority or rest. Dumbledore's portrait was at the back of the wall, the largest, the most recent, silver-bearded, half-moon spectacles on the painted nose. He was sitting in the painted version of the chair that was still in this office, because it had been his, and she had not moved it, and his eyes were closed. He had the look he always had when she'd seen him sleeping, at order meetings where he'd stayed up through the night, in the chair by the hospital wing fire during the more exhausting years, which was the look of a man who was not entirely absent, even in sleep, who was still in some way attending to things. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him. She was not ready for Harry to have this conversation yet. Harry deserved to have it, and she was going to make sure he could. And it was going to happen. But she needed to stand here first. She needed to be in this room with the portrait and decide, before anything else, what she was going to say when the time came, what she owed Harry, and what she owed herself, and what she owed the version of herself who had stood on a pavement in Surrey 17 years ago and not asked the question that would have changed everything. She stood there a long time. The portrait of Dumbledore did not move. His eyes remained closed. He breathed in the painted way the slow rise and fall of the chest that portraits had, which was not breathing, but was the memory of it. She looked at him and said nothing. Outside the high windows, the October sky went grey, and then darker grey, and the torches in the office came up of their own accord, the way they always did, responsive as the castle had always been to the fact of her presence in it. She was still deciding. He was sitting on the stairs inside the burrow when Ron found him, which meant Ron pretended not to find him and went to the kitchen instead and came back 20 minutes later with 2 mugs and left one on the step beside Harry without saying anything about it. Harry picked up the mug. He was grateful for Ron in the specific way. You were grateful for someone who had known you long enough to understand the geography of your silences. The sealed copy of the will was on his knee. He had been carrying it since Gringotts. He had been trying, since Gringotts, to do a particular piece of arithmetic. He had done it at the reading chamber table, and on the walk to the apparition point, and on the flue back to the burrow, and now here on the stairs with the mug going warm in his hands. The arithmetic was this. If the will had been read when it was supposed to be read, if someone at Gringotts had looked in the archive on the 2nd of November 1981 and found the scroll case and opened it and read it, what would have happened next? He kept arriving at the same place. Sirius Black had been arrested on the 1st of November, 1981. The day after Lily wrote this, Harry tried to hold that date in his mind clearly, as a fixed point rather than a feeling. November 1st, the will naming Sirius as primary guardian. Sirius already in ministry custody by the time any archive goblin could have found the case and acted on it. The document saying, I name this person I trust absolutely, and this person already under arrest, already facing charges for 13 murders, already being processed through a system that was going to imprison him for 12 years without ever holding a trial. So, what would a will have done? He thought about this carefully, the way Hermione thought about things, not because he was her, but because she had taught him that some questions deserve to be thought about in steps. A will naming an arrested man as guardian of an orphaned child. The wizarding legal system would have needed to do something with that. The Wizengamot would have needed to convene. There would have had to be a formal proceeding. What to do with the child of Lily and James Potter, given that the named guardian was in ministry custody on murder charges? Someone would have had to make a decision, officially, on record, with other people present. Harry thought that would have required a trial, for the will to mean anything, for Sirius to serve as his guardian. Sirius would have needed to be free. For Sirius to be free, someone would have needed to prove he hadn't done it. For someone to prove he hadn't done it, there would have needed to be evidence. And the evidence, Harry had known this since he was 13, since the night in the shrieking shack when the whole truth of it had come out in pieces over the course of an hour. The evidence was complicated. The evidence was this: 12 muggles dead in an explosion. But the Ministry's own forensic examination of Sirius's wand wouldn't have found the blasting curse on it. The evidence was a man who had reportedly been torn apart, leaving only a finger, but a man who in fact had not been torn apart at all, but had become a rat and spent the next 12 years living with a wizarding family in Devon as their pet. The evidence was that Peter Pettigrew was not dead. A real trial would have had to grapple with the missing body, with the finger, with the wand that had cast nothing, with a man who had animagus registration status, or the lack of it, because Pettigrew had never registered, because you didn't register animagus forms you were using as cover. Harry thought about this, and felt the particular cold feeling he always felt when he thought about Pettigrew. The waste of it, the cheapness of it. 12 years as Ron's rat. 12 years in the Weasley house, eating from a dish on the kitchen floor, and nobody knew. If there had been a trial in 1981, if someone with the authority and the motivation to look had looked, Pettigrew's absence from the scene might have been noticed. A finger. Just a finger. And no one had asked what that meant. He didn't know what a real trial would have found. He knew what it would have required. Evidence, time, people willing to ask questions. He knew what had been skipped. But there was another piece of arithmetic, and he had been trying to avoid it, and he could not avoid it on this staircase, with the mug going warm in his hands. If Sirius had raised him, if the trial had happened, if the evidence had been found, if Sirius had walked out of ministry custody in November 1981 with Harry in his arms and Harry's mother's will in his pocket, there would have been no bond of blood. No ancient love magic anchored to Lily's sister's house. No invisible 17-year shield that had held as long as Harry could call the Dursleys' house home, that had kept Voldemort's surviving wraith from touching him while it held. This was the part he could not unknot. He had known about the blood protection since he was 15, since Dumbledore had explained it to him in the headmaster's office after the Department of Mysteries. Explained it gently, precisely, the way Dumbledore explained things he had already decided. The protection required a blood anchor. Lily's blood in Lily's family. Petunia was the only person alive who shared that blood, and Petunia had taken Harry in, and the protection had held, and Harry was alive. He was alive in a specific way that was connected, mechanically and directly, to the fact of the cupboard under the stairs at 4 Privet Drive. He could not make the math work both ways. He had been trying. He let himself try the other version. Not the trial, not the legal machinery, just the image of it. Sirius, free. Sirius with a 15-month-old Harry in some flat he'd have chosen for proximity to James's memory, or possibly proximity to a Quidditch pitch, because Sirius, at 22, would not have thought carefully about property values or school catchment areas. Sirius, who would have put Harry on a toy broomstick the moment he could sit upright, and would have told Harry every marauder story with the serial numbers filed off, and would have let Harry stay up too late and eaten takeaway far too often, and given Harry every freedom and very little wisdom about consequences. Not because he didn't care about consequences, but because he was someone who had always believed that love was better demonstrated through presence than through caution. Harry would have been wanted. Absolutely. Without conditions or reservations or the particular coldness of people performing obligation. And Voldemort's surviving wraith, wandering, weakened, looking for a host, would have had 17 years without a blood barrier between it and Harry. He sat with this for a while. Then he thought, Sirius died in June 1996. He had died in the Department of Mysteries, falling through the veil, and Harry had spent the rest of that year trying to understand what the veil meant and whether Sirius was really gone, and accepting, eventually, that he was. He had been 15 when it happened. He had known Sirius for 2 years. 2 years of letters. One night in a tunnelled-out cave at the edge of Hogsmeade. The hours in Grimmauld Place. The Floo conversations. The particular quality of Sirius's happiness when he was somewhere he could help, rather than somewhere he was being kept safe. 2 years. If Sirius had raised him, if everything had gone differently, Harry would have lost him at 15. He would have had 14 years of the thing he had spent the whole of his actual life being shaped by the absence of, and then he would have lost it at 15, and he did not know what that version of grief looked like. He could not calculate it from where he was sitting. He only knew that it existed, that somewhere in the space of what might have been there was a 15-year-old Harry Potter who had grown up wanted and safe and had watched Sirius go through a curtain in the Department of Mysteries, and would have had to find a way to keep going after that. Harry could not decide which grief was worse. He had been trying to decide since this morning, and he could not get there, because the math required him to place a value on things that could not be converted to a common unit. 14 years loved and then lost, against 17 years not known and then lost. He could not do the sum. He drank the tea. It had gone lukewarm. Below him in the kitchen, he could hear Ron moving around doing something, probably making noise on purpose, a small sound to indicate presence without intrusion, which was something Ron had gotten very good at since May. The staircase was dim. Outside the window, the Burrows' garden had gone dark. Harry held the sealed copy of the will and sat with both things that were true, that Sirius would have loved him, and that the thing that kept him alive had required him to grow up somewhere he was not loved. He did not arrive at a verdict. He did not think there was a verdict to arrive at. He thought there was just the carrying of it, the specific weight of knowing that the world had been arranged by circumstances neither Lily nor Sirius nor anyone else had designed in the particular configuration that had produced him alive on these stairs at 18. He stayed there until Ron called him for dinner. He put the will in his coat pocket and went. Harry wrote the owl before breakfast. He kept it short because he did not know how to make it longer. I need to show you something. Can we meet today? He sent it with the first barn owl he could find in the Burrows' garden, and went inside and ate nothing and waited. Neville's reply came before 9. Name the place. They met at a small cafe off Charing Cross Road, the Muggle side of the street, equidistant from everything, and therefore neutral. Nobody's history, nobody's association. Harry arrived first and took a table at the back, and ordered tea he wasn't going to drink. He was watching the door when Neville came in, and the first thing he thought, as he always thought when he saw Neville these days, was that he still hadn't quite adjusted to the fact of this version of him. Neville at 18 had the particular quality of a person who had been tested comprehensively and found that they were, in fact, capable of the thing that was asked of them. Not arrogant about it. Not even visibly changed if you didn't know where to look. Just grounded in some way that hadn't been there before. A solidity that sat in him differently than the old nervousness had. He had pulled the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat and killed a snake in the middle of a battle. Harry figured you either found out what you were made of in a moment like that, or you didn't. And Neville had found out, and the finding out had not destroyed him. He sat down across from Harry, ordered tea without looking at the menu, and said, "All right. What is it?" Not a question either, really. Just an opening. Harry put the sealed copy of the will on the table between them. He watched Neville's face as he read it. Neville read the way he did everything now, carefully, without rushing, like someone who had learned that being thorough cost less than having to go back. He read it once. He read it again. Then he set it flat on the table and put his hands around his mug and looked at it without looking at it. "Frank and Alice Longbottom," he said. Not a question. The flat recitation of his own parents' names. "Secondary guardians," Harry said, "if Sirius couldn't serve." Neville was quiet for long enough that Harry began to think about saying something else, and then was glad he hadn't, because what Neville said when he spoke was specific in a way that clearly needed the space he'd given it. "My parents were named in your mother's will as the people who should have had you if something happened to her." He said it slowly, not as if he was struggling to understand it, but as if he was making sure he was saying it correctly. She trusted them with that. She knew them well enough to trust them with that. She said she'd watched your mother with you, Harry said. She said she knew what it looked like when someone chose love as a deliberate act. He had memorized that part without meaning to. She said she trusted them completely. Neville picked up the document. He read the relevant section again. He put it down. He was not angry. Harry had been prepared for several different versions of this conversation, and one of them had included anger, because Neville had a right to whatever he felt about this, and some of what he felt might reasonably have looked like anger. But what he saw across the table was not that. It was something quieter and more difficult, the particular expression of a person absorbing something that changes the shape of a grief they already had. I always knew they were brave, Neville said, finally. My grandmother, she told me about them. Not constantly, but enough. What they did. That they were auras. The Order. That Bellatrix. He stopped. The name still had a particular quality when Neville said it, even now, even with Bellatrix 2 years dead. I knew what happened to them. Why it happened. I knew they were people who fought for things. He looked at the will. I didn't know someone else had. Counted on that. Written it down. Before it happened. Harry said nothing. This was one of those moments that needed to stay its own shape. She put our names next to yours, Neville said. Your mother. He looked up. She put them there because she thought that if the worst happened to her, and Sirius couldn't, she thought her son would be all right with them. He looked back down at the document. And then Voldemort killed your parents, and Sirius was arrested, and my parents... He stopped again. It all happened in the same fortnight. I know. It wasn't anybody's fault, not theirs, not yours, not Lily's. The timing was just... He shook his head. The timing was just what it was. Harry had been trying to say this to himself for 2 days and hadn't quite found the words. He was glad Neville had found them first. They sat with this for a while. Around them the cafe did what cafes did. The ordinary business of people ordering and talking and not knowing that the 2 18-year-olds at the back table were doing something considerably heavier than the morning suggested. Harry thought about the arithmetic of it. If the will had been read in November 1981, and Sirius had been unavailable, November 1st, already arrested, the will would have moved to the secondary names, Frank and Alice. And Frank and Alice had been tortured to insanity shortly after the Potters died, sometime within the same terrible fortnight. Days, perhaps. A week. Harry would have been 15 months old and placed with a family that was simultaneously being destroyed. Your grandmother, Harry said, would have had both of us. Neville considered this. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, there was something that was almost wry in it. Not quite humour, but the shape that humour had when grief needed somewhere to put itself. She'd have managed, he said. She managed me alone. She'd have managed too. He looked at Harry. We would have grown up together. Brothers, Harry said. The word felt strange when he said it aloud. It felt strange, and also true, or the shape of something true. Something like that, Neville said. Something like that. 2 boys in the same house, raised by the same woman, the same absence of parents between them for different reasons, the parallel grief, the way that might have looked from the inside, 2 children growing up alongside the specific shapes of their losses. Harry thought about it, really tried to hold the image of it, and found that he couldn't quite make it solid. It was too far removed from everything that had actually happened. It was like trying to see a room through a wall. What he could hold was Neville, as he was right now, across the table, hands around his mug. This person who had earned his solidity the hard way, and who had been sitting with an 18-year loss in the Janus Thicky ward all his life, doing it with a steadiness that Harry had to admit he was not sure he would have managed. "What are they like?" Harry said. "When you visit?" Neville was quiet for a moment. He knew what Harry meant, not who his parents were in the telling of the story, the auras and the order members and the bravery, but who they were in the ward on an ordinary Tuesday. "My mother gives me sweet wrappers," he said. "Droobles. She doesn't know why she does it. She doesn't know who I am. But every time I come, she finds one somewhere, and she gives it to me." He looked at his mug. "I keep them. I've got a whole collection. Years of them." He paused. "My father just sits and looks at the window. He's not unhappy, exactly. He's just not there in the way that matters." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to try to imagine what they'd be like, if they were, if they could come back from it. What they'd say, what they'd be interested in, whether my dad would think it was funny that I'm doing herbology." A small thing crossed his face that might have been grief, or might have been something that had made its peace with grief over many repetitions. "I don't do that anymore. I just go and sit with them and accept what it is." Harry thought about the will, his mother at 21, writing Frank and Alice Longbottom's names, because she had watched Alice hold Neville and trusted her completely. He thought about what Alice Longbottom had been before the ward, and what she was now, and what the distance between those two things cost Neville every time he made the trip to St. Mungo's. He thought about how Neville had never once, not once, in 7 years of knowing him, asked for anything from the people around him on the subject of his parents, had never asked for the particular attention that a grief like his might have entitled him to ask for, had just carried it. They left the cafe when the morning was getting toward noon. On the pavement outside, Neville reached into his coat pocket and produced a Drooble's best blowing gum wrapper, slightly creased, and held it out to Harry. Harry looked at it. "I had it in my pocket," Neville said. "She gave it to me last week." "I don't know." He shrugged, not quite embarrassed. "It felt right to give you one." Harry took it. He didn't know exactly why it felt right either, but it did. The way some gestures were adequate to their moment in a way that words weren't. He folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket, next to the will. They stood on the pavement for a moment. Around them, London went on being London. "Thank you for telling me," Neville said. "I thought you'd want to know," Harry said, "that they were named. That she, yeah." Neville nodded once, the single nod of a person who understands something completely and doesn't need it expanded. "I did want to know." He went one way, Harry went the other. 2 days after the reading, Harry came downstairs at 7:30 in the morning and found Hermione already at the kitchen table with 3 books open in front of her and 4 feet of parchment covered in her small, precise handwriting. This was how Hermione responded to things that frightened her. She read until she had a complete architecture for the thing, and then she read more in case the architecture had gaps, and by the time Harry sat down across from her, she had clearly been there for several hours and had found some gaps. She looked up. She did not say good morning. "The bond of blood," she said, "is not a function of love." Harry poured himself tea from the pot that was keeping warm by the stove and sat down. He looked at her parchment. He could read, upside down, the words Lily Evans Potter and Blood Anchor and Sacrifice and Irreversible. He had been waiting for this conversation since the reading. He had been waiting for Hermione to finish building the architecture before it was possible to have the conversation. "I know," he said. "No, I mean specifically." I'd been assuming. She pulled one of the books toward her and pointed at a passage. Most people assume the protection worked because Lily loved Harry. And love is part of it. But the blood anchor isn't love. The anchor is biological. It's Lily's blood in another person's body, not Lily's friends, not Lily's colleagues or her order members or the people who loved her. Her blood. She looked at him. Petunia was the only person alive who carried that. Her elder sister. The same parents. I know, Harry said again. If Sirius had raised you, if the Longbottoms had raised you, if Lupin had raised you, none of them share Lily's blood. The protection doesn't anchor. Not because they wouldn't have loved you, not because their homes wouldn't have been good ones, because the magic is specific, and the specific thing it requires is a blood relation of the sacrificial parent. She pressed the back of her quill to her mouth. It's not negotiable. It's not something Dumbledore invented. It's how the charm works. Hermione, Harry said, I know how the charm works. She stopped. Dumbledore explained it to me in 5th year, he said, sitting in the headmaster's office after the Department of Mysteries. He sat across from me, and he explained why Petunia's house was the safest place in the world for me as long as I could call it home. He explained the blood. I understood it then, and I understand it now. He put his mug down. That's not the part I can't accept. Hermione was quiet. She looked at him with the particular look she had when she was recalibrating, when the argument she'd been building turned out to have been addressing the wrong question. Outside the Burrows' kitchen window, the garden was going from grey to pale gold with the morning, and somewhere upstairs a door opened and closed, and they both waited until the footsteps on the stairs passed and didn't come to the kitchen. What is the part, she said carefully, that you can't accept? Harry had been trying to find the words for this since the reading chamber, since the goblin's flat voice reading his mother's handwriting in a room full of people who had all understood, independently and at the same moment, what had happened. He thought he had the words now. He could have told them, Harry said. Sirius, the Longbottoms. He could have gone to whoever held the will, if he knew about it, if he'd checked, and he could have said, Lily named these people. She trusted them. The blood magic requires Petunia, and I'm going to honor that. But I want you to know that Lily asked you, that she chose you. He picked up his mug. Or he could have told me, when I was old enough. He could have told me that my mother left a will, that she thought ahead, that she named 2 sets of people who would have loved me, and that the blood protection made it impossible for them to serve. He could have said, this is why the Dursleys, and this is what Lily actually wanted. He put the mug down again. He said no one else. He said it on the night of the 1st of November 1981 to McGonagall on a Surrey pavement, and there was a will sitting in a Gringotts archive that named 2 people specifically, and he said no one else. Hermione was looking at him steadily. What he took, Harry said, wasn't the outcome. Maybe the outcome was always going to be Privet Drive because of the blood. Maybe there was never a version where it was different, mechanically. What he took was the acknowledgement, the recognition that Lily's wishes existed, that she had sat down and written something, and he just went around it, as if it wasn't there. You don't know that he knew about it, Hermione said. I know he could have checked. He held her gaze. The same way I know that if Dumbledore had wanted to know whether Lily left a will, he would have found out. He found out everything he decided to find out. He decided not to find out about this, or he decided it didn't change anything, and either way he acted as though Lily's wishes were his to override without explanation. He never said, "Here is what your mother asked for." He never said, "I went and I looked, and this is what I found." He stopped. He said no one else. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The garden's morning light had shifted. There were birds somewhere out in the apple trees. "Harry," Hermione said. She said it the way she said things when she was about to say the thing that neither of them wanted to say, which Harry recognized because she'd been doing it since they were 11, and he had never found a way to stop her, and was not sure he would want to even now. Dumbledore's reasoning was correct, she said. She said it quietly, and she did not look away. "I don't mean kind. I don't mean honest. I don't mean the method was right, or that he was entitled to make the decision alone without telling you or telling Sirius or finding the will and explaining himself to anyone." She was precise about this, the way she was precise about everything she had thought through carefully. But the reasoning, the logic, the conclusion he reached, that the blood protection was the thing that kept you alive from November 1981 to July 1997, and that Petunia was the only person who could anchor it, that was correct. "You're here." She stopped for a moment. "Harry, you survived Voldemort 7 times. The blood protection was part of the reason you survived long enough to be the person who could destroy him." He heard her. He had been expecting her to say it, and he heard it clearly, and it landed the way it always landed, as an argument with no flaw in the logic and no satisfying answer. "I know," he said. She waited. "It still wasn't right," he said. She didn't say anything else. She didn't try to close the gap between those two positions, because there wasn't a way to close it. Dumbledore's reasoning was correct. His method was not. His silence was not. His no one else was not. Not because the conclusion was wrong, but because the conclusion was not his alone to arrive at, in a room without witnesses, on a pavement in the small hours, with a sealed will in a bank archive a few miles away that said otherwise. Both things were true. They sat across from each other at the Burrow kitchen table, and they both knew it, and neither of them knew what to do with that. That was, Harry thought, where most honest things ended up eventually. Not at a verdict, but at a pair of truths that couldn't be reconciled, only carried. Outside the window, the garden went on being the garden. Inside the house, someone was coming down the stairs, Ron's particular footfall, too well known to be anyone else. And by the time he came through the kitchen door, Hermione had pulled one of the books back toward her, and Harry was drinking his tea, and nothing about the room indicated that they had just spent 20 minutes working their way to the bottom of something neither could resolve. "Right," Ron said, looking at the books, and then at their faces, and understanding, with the fluency of someone who had been doing this for 7 years, that there was nothing useful he could add. He went to make toast. He didn't ask. They sat together in the kitchen, the 3 of them, and the morning came in through the window, and Hermione read, and Ron made toast, and Harry held the 2 things that were true and didn't try to make them into one. The castle had been repaired from the inside out, which meant the surface wounds were the ones that lingered. The entrance hall scaffolding was still up on the eastern side. A section of the 5th-floor corridor had new stone in it that was paler than the old, a seam of lighter grey running along one wall where the original had come down in the battle. Harry walked past it, the way he walked past most things at Hogwarts these days, with the particular quality of attention a person gave a place they knew so thoroughly that what had changed was more visible than what had stayed. He knew these corridors. He had learned them in darkness, in urgency, in detention, in the specific aimless familiarity of someone who had lived here for 6 years and still found new passages. He had run through them. He had hidden in them. He had come back to them and found them full of the dead, and found them now in the slow business of becoming themselves again. He understood that this was what buildings did after terrible things. They mended from the structural outward, and the surface was always the last to close. McGonagall was waiting for him at the bottom of the moving staircase that led to the headmaster's office. She had known he was coming. He had owled this morning. 2 words, "I'm coming," and she had replied with the current password, which was sufficient communication for the occasion. She fell into step beside him as he reached her, and they went up the stair together without saying anything, and Harry did not find this strange. There were conversations that didn't need a preamble. This was one of them. The headmaster's office had changed in the small ways. Offices changed when they became someone else's. Different papers on the desk, different books in the nearest shelves, a tartan scarf on the hook by the door that had not been there before. The pensive was still in its cabinet. The sorting hat was still on its shelf, eyes shut in the particular way of an old object that had been alive so long it had developed definitive opinions about when it was and wasn't interested in being consulted. And along the walls, in their frames, the former headmasters and headmistresses of Hogwarts, painted into their chairs and their robes and their postures of authority or ease. Dumbledore's portrait was at the back of the wall. He was watching when Harry came in. The painted eyes were open, blue, behind the half-moon spectacles that were just as Harry remembered them, every time. And they tracked him as he crossed the room, not with any obvious urgency, but with the quality of complete attention that had always been Dumbledore's particular gift and, sometimes, his instrument. The silver beard, the long hands resting on the arms of the painted chair, everything that was Dumbledore about Dumbledore, rendered in oil and preserved in paint, 2 years after the man was dead. Harry stopped in front of the portrait and stood there for a moment. Then he said, "Did you know about the will?" "I knew Lily Potter was a thorough woman," the portrait said, "who prepared carefully for things she hoped would never happen." "That isn't an answer." A pause. The portrait of Dumbledore had the quality of a very good copy of a man, which was to say, it had his pauses. "I did not locate a specific document at Gringotts before placing you on the Dursley doorstep. I made a decision on the night of the 1st of November, 1981, based on the information I had. The information I had was sufficient to conclude that the blood protection was the paramount priority. It is possible there was additional information I didn't seek." The painted eyes didn't waver. "That is the honest account." Harry held this. "It is possible," he repeated. "Yes." "You didn't check." He said it flatly because it was flat. "You had access to Gringotts. You had access to everything, always, that's the thing. If Lily left something there, you could have found it. You could have looked. The morning after. You could have looked weeks later. You could have looked before I turned 11 and went for the first time. You could have looked at any point in 17 years, and you didn't." "The blood protection required Petunia Dursley," the portrait said. "That would not have changed regardless of any document's contents." "I know that." His voice was level. He had been working on that since the burrow stairs. "I know it wouldn't have changed the practical outcome. I know the blood magic required Petunia, and Petunia is the only person alive who could anchor it, and I was always going to end up at Privet Drive because of that. That's not what I'm asking about." He looked at the portrait steadily. "I'm asking about my mother. She sat at a table in Godric's Hollow 6 weeks before she died. and she wrote down the names of the people she trusted with me, and she sealed it in copper, and she went to Gringotts the next morning, and she left it there. And you placed me on a doorstep with a letter to Petunia, and you said no one else. You said it to McGonagall that night, and you never said anything different to anyone for 17 years. The portrait was quiet for a moment. I developed, it said finally, a habit of deciding how much you needed to know. And when. I believed, for most of your life, that the information I withheld from you was withheld in your interest. The painted voice was steady. It was Dumbledore's voice. It was the voice Harry had known for 6 years, and it said true things, and it could not make them feel like enough. I believe now, I reflect now, in the way that portraits reflect, that I was not always correct in that assessment, that there were things you needed to know that I judged you not ready for, or that I judged would not change the necessary outcome, and I was wrong about the readiness and wrong about the outcome's necessity. Your mother's wishes were not mine to act upon without acknowledgement. The named guardians deserved to be told. The painted eyes looked at him. I cannot give you more than that. I know, Harry said. He had known before he came. I know you can't. He had come because he needed to ask. He had known, coming through the gates this morning, that the portrait would give him facts, clear facts, more clearly stated perhaps than the living man might have managed, because the portrait had nothing left to protect and no future to arrange. But that facts were not what he actually wanted. What he wanted was the man himself, sitting across from him, the way he had sat in the headmaster's office at the end of every year, with something Harry needed to know. And he wanted to look at the man and have the man look back, and he wanted it to cost the man something to explain himself. He wanted remorse. Not the portrait's reflection of what remorse was, but the thing itself, the weight of it in another person's body, looking him in the eye. The portrait could not give him that. It was a painting. It was what Albus Dumbledore had left of himself, accurate, responsive, and ultimately insufficient for the thing Harry actually needed, which was a man who was no longer there. McGonagall moved beside him. She had been standing a few feet back since they entered, and now she took a step closer, and Harry turned toward her. And what he saw in her face was not the headmistress' composure she wore through most things, but something older and more private. I was there that night, she said. On the 1st of November, 1981. You know that. I know. I protested. She held his gaze. I had been watching those people since morning. Dumbledore had sent me to observe them, and I did. And what I observed was everything you eventually found out for yourself about what it was like to live in that house. I told him. I told him they were the worst sort of muggles. I said you could not possibly mean to leave him here. She stopped. The composure held, but it was the composure of someone gripping it deliberately. He explained the blood, the protection. I understood the mechanism. I didn't ask. A breath. I didn't ask whether he had checked Gringotts, whether Lily had left anything. I assumed he had done everything there was to do, and found the conclusion inevitable. I had trusted him for 30 years, and I assumed. She paused. I should have asked. I could have asked. I didn't ask. Harry looked at her for a moment. She was not asking him to say it was all right. She was telling him a true thing because he deserved to have it, even though it was going to cost her something to say it clearly. I know you protested, he said. He had known this since his 3rd year, had heard it mentioned, the way things got mentioned when someone was explaining the particular carefulness of Dumbledore's arrangements. McGonagall on a pavement, saying those people, and Dumbledore saying no one else. "I've known for a long time." She was quiet. "I don't blame you," Harry said. He meant it in a specific way, not the way you said it when you were dismissing the thing, not as a closing of the subject, but as a thing that was true and deserved to be said aloud. "I needed you to say it, that you were there and you objected. I needed that to be said by you, in the same room as him." He glanced at the portrait. Even him like that. She nodded once. Not relief, exactly. Something more than that, or differently shaped. He looked at the portrait for a last moment. The painted eyes were still watching. He thought about asking something else, and decided against it. He had what he came for. He turned and walked toward the door. Behind him, he heard nothing. He did not look back, but he understood from the quality of the silence that the portrait of Albus Dumbledore was watching him go, and that this was all it had left to offer, and that it was offering it. The hospital smelled of dittany and floor cleaner, and something underneath both of those that Neville had never been able to identify, and had long since stopped trying. It was just the smell of St. Mungo's, which was the smell of a building doing its best against things that could not, in the end, be fixed. He came in through the Purge and Dow's entrance the way he always did, window display of mannequins on the Muggle side, the particular pressure change as you stepped through the glass, and went straight to the lifts. He had been doing this for as long as he could remember, doing deliberate things. His grandmother had brought him the first few years, when he was too young to come alone, and after that he'd come on his own, in the way that you came to things you needed to do, and had worked out the procedure for. He knew the route by the changes in the floor. 3rd floor, Janus Thicky ward, the double doors at the end of the ward where the long-term cases were kept, and the particular quality of quiet that the ward had, because long-term meant not getting better, and not getting better meant that the ward had stopped being the kind of place where you waited for news. The healer who covered the ward on Thursdays knew him now. She nodded without stopping what she was doing, and Neville nodded back and went to the room at the far end and went in. His mother was by the window. She had been seated by the window at most of his visits for as long as he could remember, whether by preference or by the staff's reasonable assessment that the window was where she settled most comfortably, he had never established. She had a waxy, vacant quality to her face, which was the face he knew as her face, because he had never known the other one, or had known it only in the first 15 months of his life, and had no memory of it. He had seen photographs. He knew, from photographs, and from what his grandmother said, who she had been. The face in the ward and the face in the photographs were clearly the same person, and had nothing to do with each other. She looked up when he came in. She did not know who he was. She never did. And he had stopped, somewhere around age 12, feeling the fresh cut of this at each visit. It was just what it was. He sat down in the chair across from her, and said hello, and she looked at him with the mild interest she gave most things in the room. And then she reached into the pocket of her hospital cardigan and produced a Drubel's Best blowing gum wrapper, slightly flattened, and held it out to him. He took it. He always took it. He did not know why she did it, and he did not know if she had always done it, or if it had developed as a habit during the years of the ward. He knew only that she did it, reliably, at almost every visit, and that he had been carrying the wrappers home since he was old enough to have a pocket to carry them in. He folded this one and put it in his coat pocket. His father was in the chair near the door, looking at the wall. He was not unhappy. Neville had asked the healers about this more than once, in the specific way you asked about something you needed to believe had an answer, and they had said that Frank Longbottom showed no signs of distress, that he was comfortable, that he responded to basic care and to some sensory things. He was just not there in the ways that counted. He was a person who had been someone and was not that someone anymore, and the someone he had been was the kind of person Lily Potter had trusted with her son. And this was the new weight that Neville was carrying into the room this week, along with the Drubel's wrappers, and the chair, and the routine of it. "I found out something this week," Neville said, to both of them in the way he always spoke to both of them. "I thought you should know." His mother looked at him with her mild attention. His father continued looking at the wall. "Harry Potter's mother left a will. When she died, before she died, 6 weeks before, she wrote down who should look after Harry if she couldn't." He had rehearsed how to say this, not because he was nervous about it, but because finding the right words for things had always seemed to him like a way of respecting the things. "She put your names in it. Secondary guardians. If the first person she named couldn't serve." The ward was quiet in its particular way. Down the corridor, someone was asking a question in a low voice, and no one was answering. "She wrote that she'd watched you with me," Neville said. "She said she knew what it was to see people choose love as a deliberate act. She said she trusted you completely." He looked at his mother's waxy, unchanged face. "She chose you for Harry, before any of it happened." She wrote it down. His mother shifted slightly in her chair. The movement was nothing, a small rearrangement that meant nothing and was not a response to what he'd said. Neville knew that. He had always known that. He came and talked to them anyway because it felt dishonest not to, and because somewhere in the 18 years of visits he had decided that the point of talking to people you loved was not always to be heard in the way you meant. What he did not say that Bellatrix Lestrange was dead. He had not said this to them on his previous visit either, or the one before that, though she had been dead since May and would presumably remain dead. Molly Weasley had killed her in the Great Hall, and Neville had not been there to see it. He had been somewhere else in the battle, and he had felt, when he heard, a very specific thing that he had never found a word for. Not relief exactly, not satisfaction. Something that was the right shape for relief, and did not feel the way he expected relief to feel, because Bellatrix being dead gave him nothing back. It only made it so she couldn't do it to anyone else. He had killed Nagini with the sword of Gryffindor. He had done what the moment asked, and he had done it cleanly. He thought about it sometimes, in the way you thought about something that was part of you now, and was always going to be part of you. Not with pride, exactly. Not with anything that resolved into a clean feeling, but with a clear-eyed acknowledgement that he had been capable of the thing and had done it when it needed doing. It was a Horcrux. It was the last one. He did not fully understand the mechanics of all of it, but he understood that the snake had needed to die, and he had been the one there to do it. None of this gave his parents back. He sat with them for an hour. He talked, occasionally. Small things, the way the herbology greenhouses were coming along, a thing his grandmother had said about her neighbor's garden, the detail of the weather over the past week. He did not know if it helped or not. He came because not coming felt wrong, and talking while he was there felt less wrong than sitting in silence. So he talked. Before he left, his mother gave him another wrapper. He was not sure if she had another one or if she had somehow retrieved the first. He folded this one and put it in his other coat pocket. He said goodbye to his father, who did not respond. He said goodbye to his mother, who looked at him with her mild expression, the same expression she would give the wall after he left. He told them he would come next week, which was true, and went back through the double doors. Outside on the pavement, the entrance was an ordinary London street, Muggle shoppers going past, nothing to indicate that behind the mannequins in the window there was a hospital ward where people who could not be fixed were living out their particular form of surviving. He stopped and put his hand in his pocket. He had quite a collection now. He had started keeping track somewhere around his 4th year at Hogwarts, counting them, putting them in an envelope in his bedside drawer. Different colours, different degrees of flattening, some of them faded at the folds where they'd been kept a long time. His mother had given them to him across hundreds of visits and did not know she had done it, and he had kept everyone, and he did not know exactly why, except that they were hers. They were the closest thing to a letter she had ever sent him. He stood on the pavement outside Purge and Dow's Lettered in the late afternoon and held the wrappers in his palm. Then he put them back in his pocket and turned toward the apparition point. He would come again next week. He would sit in the chair across from her face, and she would give him another one, and he would take it the way he always took it, and that would be the thing that it was. Not enough, but sustained, and his, and ongoing, and something. He walked toward the junction. Around him, the street did what streets did, which was to say it continued. He had been here once before in his own memory, Christmas Eve 1997, with Hermione, in the middle of everything. They had come disguised and half-frozen, and looking for something they hadn't quite found, and the night had ended with a dead woman's house, and a snake, and his wand destroyed, and he had not been back since. He had thought about coming back. He had not been ready to come back until now, and he was not entirely sure he was ready now, but he had come anyway, because the will had been in his coat pocket for 10 days, and there was somewhere it needed to be read aloud, and this was the place. Godric's Hollow in November was quiet in the way small English villages were quiet, not empty, but at rest, the kind of stillness that came from generations of ordinary life, continuing in ordinary ways, uninterrupted. He walked from the apparition point, with his hands in his pockets, and his breath visible in the cold. The church was at the centre. He went there first. The war memorial stood at the junction, where the lane met the village square. To a Muggle it was an obelisk of dark stone, with names carved into it, the ordinary, quiet monument of a village that had given something to a war. To Harry, it was a family. The stone shifted as he looked at it, not physically, but in the way that certain enchantments shifted when a wizard's attention moved across them, and became a statue, a man and a woman, young, holding a baby. James Potter had messy black hair and wore glasses, and the particular posture of someone who had been athletic and had always known it. Lily Potter had long hair, and her arms were around the baby, with a quality of holding that was not decorative, but real, the way you held something you were not going to set down. Harry stood in front of the statue for a long time. He had stood in front of it on Christmas Eve 1997, briefly, half mad with cold and urgency, and had not been able to look at it properly. He looked at it properly now. James Potter had been 21 years old when he died. Lily Potter had been 21 years old when she died. Harry was 18. In 3 years he would be as old as they had ever been. He had not done this particular math before, or he had done it and set it down without pressing on it, the way you set down things that had a quality of too much if you held them too long. He stood with it now. 21. His father had been 21, with a baby and a hidden house, and Voldemort at the door, and had apparently never stopped being the kind of person who played Quidditch with full commitment, and laughed too loudly, and couldn't help being charming. His mother had been 21, and writing a will at the kitchen table at midnight, because she was not the kind of person who failed to prepare for things, even things she hoped would never happen. He was 18 and he had fought a war, and he was standing in a village square in November, looking at a stone statue of his parents, and for the first time in his life, he felt something that was not only grief, but something adjacent to it. The particular vertigo of understanding that they were people, specific and contemporaneous, who had existed in a time he was approaching the age to have shared. He went to the churchyard. The graves were there the way he remembered them, modest, tended, the inscription the same. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. He had stood here in 1997 with Hermione and not known what to say, and she had conjured flowers, and it had been enough for that night. He didn't conjure anything today. He just stood there for a moment, and then he took out the will. He had rehearsed this, if rehearsed was the word for what he'd done on the walk from the apparition point, which was to understand in advance that he was going to read this aloud and that he was not going to feel embarrassed about it. He had talked to gravestones before. He had talked to Dumbledore's portrait. He had talked to Sirius through a two-way mirror that didn't connect to anything. He was not a person who required a living audience to make speaking worthwhile. He unfolded the sealed copy and found the last section, the part that wasn't legal language, and read, "To my son Harry, if you are reading this, I am sorry you needed to. I wrote this hoping you would never need to, that you would grow up with me alive, and this document collecting dust for 60 years. I know what kind of hope this is, and I wrote it down anyway." The churchyard was very quiet, wind in the yew trees at the edge. I named Sirius first, because he loves your father, and because he will love you the same way, without conditions. I named the Longbottoms because I have watched Alice hold her son when she thought no one was looking, and I trust her completely. These are not choices I made because they were convenient. They are choices I made because you deserve people who will choose you back. He stopped for a moment. Not because he couldn't go on, but because the next part was the part that had been living in him for 10 days. The part he had been carrying around under everything else. Whatever happened, whatever is true by the time you read this, I need you to know that I sat down and thought about you specifically. Not about what was safest or what was easiest. About you. About who should have you. I am your mother, and I am 21 years old, and I am going to go home now. And I am not going to think about this document again, if I can help it. But I wrote it. You should know. I wrote it. L. He stood with his mother's handwriting in his hands, and the graves of his parents in front of him, and the village quiet around him. And he understood. He thought he understood, finally, what he had been trying to get to since the reading chamber. What the will told him about who she was. Not just the sacrifice. He had known about the sacrifice his whole life. The woman who stood between him and a killing curse and refused to move. The story of what she had done the night she died had been the whole of what he had for most of his life when he thought of her. The sacrifice was what remained when everything else had been taken. But the sacrifice was a moment. One night, one decision, 1 minute at the end of everything. She had also been a woman who sat down in September 1981 with a quill and a legal document and wrote out methodically, in the same precise way, she had brewed potions and studied charms and done everything she decided to do well. Who should love her son if she couldn't? She had thought about Sirius specifically, what he was like, what he would give Harry, the quality of his love. She had thought about Alice Longbottom holding Neville when she thought no one was looking, and found in that image something so trustworthy that she wrote it into law. She had been 21 years old and hunted and living under a Fidelius charm, and she had made time for this. She had done it in the precise, deliberate way of a person who understood that love was not only a feeling, but an act, and that the act required preparation, and that preparation required honesty about the worst that could happen. He stood there until the afternoon light shifted into something lower and colder, and then he stood there a little longer. He thought about Sirius. Sirius, who had loved him for 2 years, and would have loved him for 18, who would have been reckless and warm and present in the particular way of people who had never learned to be careful with love, and did not consider this a deficiency. He thought about the 2 years and the lost 18, and the impossible arithmetic of it, the question he couldn't answer about which version of that grief was worse. He thought about Neville, who had given him a Drubel's wrapper outside the cafe on a London pavement because he had one in his pocket, and it felt right. Neville, who had been carrying his particular shape of loss for 18 years in the practiced, methodical way of someone who had worked out the procedure for it, who had sat across from Harry at a neutral table and said the timing was just what it was, and meant it, and had gone home afterward and kept going. He thought about the blood protection. 17 years of invisible armor. His mother had made it with her death, and Dumbledore had anchored it to Petunia's house, and it had held until his 17th birthday, and it had kept him alive through things that should have killed him before he was old enough to understand why they were trying to. He had lived inside it without knowing it was there. He had called Privet Drive home, in the technical sense required to maintain it, the cold minimum of home, and the magic had taken that and held. Both things were true. They had always been both true since the 1st of November 1981, since before he was old enough to know anything. The armor and the will, the protection and the wish, the thing that kept him alive, and the thing that said what alive was supposed to mean, what it was supposed to look like, who was supposed to be there. He folded the will. He put it back in his coat pocket, next to the Drubel's wrapper he had not taken out since Neville gave it to him. He looked at the graves for a last moment. Lily Potter, born 30th January 1960. James Potter, born 27th March 1960. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. He had nothing particular to say that he had not already said. He had read her the document she wrote for him. That seemed like enough. That seemed like what this visit was. He walked toward the apparition point. The village went on being the village around him. Ordinary, quiet, carrying its own dead the way all places carried them, in the fabric of the stones and the names in the churchyard, and the small, persistent fact of having been here before anything that happened to Harry Potter and continuing to be here now. He turned at the junction and was gone. He went to Grimmauld Place first, before the Burrow. He had not planned to. He had apparated with the intention of going straight to the Weasleys, but he found himself standing outside number 12 instead, looking at the black door with its silver serpent knocker, and understood that there was something here that needed doing before the evening could start properly. The house received him the way it always received him, with the specific indifference of a building that had been occupied and abandoned too many times to form a strong opinion about any particular arrival. The hallway was cold. The portrait of Walburga Black was silent behind its curtain. It had been silent since Harry had found the trick of it, years ago, and he had developed the habit of walking past without looking at the curtain on the principle that acknowledging things you'd rather weren't there was sometimes worse than not. The smell of the house was old wallpaper and something deeper, older, the particular smell of a place that had housed a family for generations and held the residue of all of it in the walls. Creature was in the kitchen. He was very old. He had always been very old, in the way that house elves accumulated years differently from wizards, and the Battle of Hogwarts had added something to the oldness that was not age exactly, but was what extreme effort did to ancient things. He looked up when Harry came in, and gave a short nod that was his version, these days, of something that Harry had come to understand as welcome. "I won't stay long," Harry said. "I've got the burrow tonight. I just wanted to come through." Creature nodded again, and turned back to whatever he was doing with a pot at the stove. He kept the kitchen running on a schedule Harry had stopped trying to understand, and had simply accepted. Harry stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room. He had stood in this kitchen on some of the worst nights of his life. The summer before 5th year, the months when Grimmauld Place had been Order headquarters, and the house had been full of people crowded into something that wasn't quite comfort. He had stood in it with Sirius, who had sat at the kitchen table with the specific quality of a man being kept somewhere against his will, even when the walls were technically his own. Sirius had hated this house. Harry had known this in a general way for years, but understood it differently now. Now that he had stood in a churchyard this afternoon and done the math of 21, and thought carefully about who Sirius was and what he would have been as a person who raised a child. Sirius had stayed in this house during the war because the house was needed, not because he wanted to be in it. He had chafed at the confinement with the particular restlessness of someone who had survived Azkaban by thinking about being elsewhere, and Grimmauld Place was a form of elsewhere that felt too much like what he'd left. The house was not Sirius. The house was the Black family's dark and formal inheritance, which Sirius had also inherited and had never been comfortable owning. If Sirius had raised Harry, here or anywhere, because Sirius would have gone anywhere Harry needed, it would have been because Harry was the reason to go. Not the house, not the history, the person. Harry looked at the kitchen, at Creature's bent back, at the window with its below-ground view of the area steps. He thought, the house is just a house. He had always known this in the abstract. He understood it differently now, not as a philosophical position, but as a lived fact. The way you understood things when you had been to Godric's Hollow and read your mother's handwriting to a stone statue in a churchyard, and walked back to the apparition point, and not fallen apart. The house was just a house. What it held was memory, and memory was not a monument. You could live in a place that held memory without the memory being the only thing the place was for. "Take care of yourself," he said to Creature, which was also what he always said. Creature made a sound that was either assent or dismissal, and had probably been both for so long that the distinction no longer served any purpose. Harry went back through the hallway, past Walburga's curtain, out the door. The burrow was noise before he was through the gate. He could hear George's voice from the garden. George was loud in the particular way of people who had always been loud, and were working out whether loudness still belonged to them, when the person who had been loud alongside them was gone. The answer seemed to be yes, mostly, with occasional silences that arrived without announcement and went the same way. Harry had learned to recognize those silences and leave them alone. Ron met him at the back door. He looked at Harry's face for exactly the amount of time required to establish that Harry had come back from wherever he'd been in the state that meant he'd come back all right, and then he stood aside to let him in and said, "George brought something from the shop that we're not supposed to eat until after dinner, which means Hermione has already done a complete inventory of it." "Has she?" "She'd never touch it before dinner," Ron said. with the certainty of someone who had lived with Hermione Granger's principles for 7 years and found them entirely predictable. But she has strong opinions ready. The kitchen was full in the way the Burrow kitchen was always full, the table already covered with things that would resolve into dinner eventually, Molly's influence present in the organization of it, even when she wasn't. The kitchen being the kind of kitchen that remembered every meal it had produced and kept the quality of all of them in the air. Hermione was at the end of the table with a book, which was her natural habitat in any room she was in for more than 10 minutes. Ginny was near the window, talking to Neville about something that seemed to involve enthusiastic disagreement on Neville's part about the correct approach to some herbology question Harry didn't have the background to follow. George was by the door to the garden with a mug and the kind of expression he wore when he was thinking about something he wasn't going to mention. Nobody asked Harry how it had gone. They had all, he thought about this later, sitting on the back step in the dark, become very good at this. Not at pretending that nothing had happened, but at knowing the difference between the kind of aftermath that needed immediate attention and the kind that needed to be left alone to settle. He had come back from Godric's Hollow without the look of a person who needed the kind of attention that required stopping what you were doing. They registered this and went on, which was the most generous thing they could have done. Dinner was loud and ordinary. George made a point about something, loudly. Ron beat Harry comprehensively at chess afterwards. This was a constant of Harry's life that he had accepted the way he had accepted other constants, the sun rising and certain spells requiring a specific wrist movement, and did not apologize for it. Hermione read. Ginny sat close enough to Harry that they were almost, but not quite, touching, which was a form of closeness Harry had come to understand as its own language. I am here, I am not going anywhere, you don't have to say anything. Neville left at 9. He had early mornings, he said. The herbology greenhouses needed attention before the cold got worse, and he had things he needed to do before that. He said good night to everyone in the specific Neville way of departing, which was to mean it and make it brief, and was gone. Later, after George had gone, after Hermione and Ron had gone upstairs, after Ginny had fallen asleep on the sofa, in the comfortable way of someone who had earned a rest and was taking it, Harry went out to the back step. November. The garden was dark beyond the step's light, the apple trees at the far end visible as shapes rather than details. He sat with his coat on and his hands around a mug that had gone cold without him noticing, and thought about nothing for a while, which was something he had gotten better at over the past few months, the particular skill of not thinking, of simply being in a place, and letting it be a place. The blood protection had ended on his 17th birthday. He had been living without it for a year and 4 months now, living in his own skin without the invisible 17-year armor his mother had made for him, and he had not fallen apart. He had fought a war in that time, and he had not fallen apart. He was sitting on a back step in November at 18 years old, and he was here, and the armor was gone, and he had not fallen apart. His mother built the armor. She also left the will. Both were things she had done for him. The sacrifice and the preparation, the protection and the wish, the magic that kept him alive, and the document that said what alive was supposed to mean. Both had come from the same person, sitting at a table in Godric's Hollow, deciding deliberately what she loved and what she intended to do about it. The armor had kept him alive. The will had kept him known. He had not had the will until 10 days ago, but it had existed for 17 years, and she had written it, and it had said his name. He could hold both. He had been learning how to hold both things since the reading chamber, and he thought, sitting on the back step with the cold garden in front of him and the warm house behind him, that he was starting to understand what holding them actually felt like. It did not feel like resolution. It felt like weight that had found its proper distribution, still present, still real, but no longer something he was dropping and picking up. Something he was carrying, and had the capacity to carry, and was going to continue carrying for as long as he was the person who carried it.